year 1887, the world was caught between two times. Old traditions that held people by the throat and new inventions that promised to change everything. Gas lamps flickered along narrow streets. Horse-drawn carriages rattled across cobblestone roads, and families tried to hold on to a sense of order in a world that was already beginning to slip through their fingers. Death was no stranger to that time. Illness claimed children before they could grow, accidents were common, and grief sat quietly in the corners of many homes. But even then, some stories unsettled people more than others, stories that whispered of something darker than fate. The boy's photograph would one day become one of those stories. A single image, taken after his last breath, would stir questions that never seemed to rest. At first glance, it was the picture of innocence preserved, a child dressed neatly, his eyes closed as if in sleep. But the longer one looked, the more the picture felt wrong, like a truth that was meant to be hidden had been laid bare. Behind the stillness of that photograph was a family, a household filled with love, fear, and secrets that none of them could control. The house where it began stood on the edge of a quiet town, built of red brick and trimmed with iron gates. It was the kind of home that marked wealth in an age when most people lived cramped in wooden rooms that creaked under the weight of too many bodies. The family inside was known, respected, and even envied. Their fortune had been built on trade and inheritance, but their pride rested on something more personal: the children. Children, in that age, were seen as both blessings and burdens, the proof of a family's strength and the carriers of its future. Every cough, every fever, every fall brought with it the shadow of loss. Parents learned to live with the constant fear that life could be pulled away in an instant. Inside that house, laughter often carried through the halls, but so did silence. The boy was not the firstborn, nor the last, but he had been the one most doted upon. Perhaps it was his delicate health, perhaps it was the way he clung to his mother's side, but from the beginning his presence carried a kind of fragile weight. His father, a stern man shaped by money and reputation, kept his distance, watching more than embracing. His mother, by contrast, was consumed with him. She hovered, she worried, she prayed. In her care, love and fear were always entangled, one feeding the other. To outsiders, there was nothing strange. The family appeared to live the same way others of their class did. Dinners with silver polished until it gleamed, church on Sundays, evenings spent with books or music while the servants moved quietly in the background. Yet there were small cracks in glass. Behind the walls, there were arguments, the kind that never reached the streets. The father spoke of strength, of letting boys harden, of refusing to let illness dictate the rhythm of life. The mother clung to gentleness, believing that protecting the boy was the same as saving him. These differences, spoken in hushed tones at night, left a chill in the air during the day. The boy himself moved between these worlds, sometimes caught in the warmth of his mother's arms, sometimes shrinking under his father's sharp gaze. He was not sickly, not in a way that drew immediate alarm, but he was fragile enough that every cough sent shivers through the household. There was always the sense that he was walking a thin line between health and something more dangerous. Neighbors often commented on how pale he was, how quiet, though they said it in tones that mixed pity with admiration. In that time, a child who seemed delicate was often seen as angelic, touched by something otherworldly, even if it was only the shadow of sickness. But the boy's story was not only one of illness. He was curious, gentle, and at times playful. He wandered the halls with small steps, carrying toys that seemed far too old-fashioned even for that time. He had a way of looking at people with a stillness that unsettled them, as though he was watching more than he should, as though he understood things that were not meant for children. And when he laughed, it was soft, like it was caught between happiness and something else, something unspoken that I in the town. Whispers grew, not whispers of scandal, but of admiration mixed with unease. Some said the family's devotion to the boy was excessive, that it was not healthy for a child to live under such constant protection. Others hinted that the father's coldness and the mother's smothering were bound to collide, that no child could grow up whole in such a divided home. Still, no one spoke these thoughts aloud. Respect kept tongues quiet. Even his curiosity gnawed at the edges that it was in the small details that the foreshadowing lived. The boy's sudden absences from gatherings, the way his mother's eyes seemed to dart with hidden worry, and the way the servants grew uneasy when asked too many questions. There was something in that SE that seemed to lean toward loss, as if it were built to hold grief even before grief had arrived. And one could have known that the photograph would become the family's most lasting memory of him. No one could have guessed that the still image, meant to honor him, would instead disturb generations to come. Yet even in those early days, the pieces were already falling into place. The boy's fragility, the clash between his parents, the silence that filled the halls, all of it was pointing toward an ending that no one could stop. The town continued to move forward. Carriages rolled down the streets, shops opened each morning, and children played in dusty yards, unaware of the storm quietly forming inside the house at the edge of town. It was a house filled with love and pride, but also with shadows. And within those walls, a boy's life would be preserved in a way no one could have imagined, caught forever in a moment that blurred the line between memory and horror. The boy's health, always delicate, began to waver as the season shifted. The damp air of spring brought fevers that lingered, and every small cough seemed to tighten the silence in the household. His mother, already so fiercely protective, grew more anxious with each passing week. She hovered over him like a shadow, refusing to let him play outside without supervision, wrapping him in layers of blankets even when the sun was high. Her love, though rooted in fear, began to feel more like an obsession, as if keeping him close could fight back the inevitable. She often prayed aloud, whispering words not just to God, but to herself, as though she was bargaining with something unseen. His father watched this with growing resentment. He believed that the boy was being weakened not by illness, but by his mother's suffocating care. He had always valued strength, and to him, fragility was a kind of shame. He pushed back against her protection, demanding that the boy be allowed to face the world, to toughen himself. Their arguments grew sharper, cutting through the silence of the house at night. The servants, who once went about unnoticed, began to pause outside closed doors, listening as voices rose, carrying words that could not be forgotten. One evening, the father insisted the boy walk to church rather than be carried in the carriage. The mother protested, saying his cough was too severe, but the father refused to bend. The boy, pale and unsteady, stumbled along the cobbled path while his father held his hand with a grip that felt more like restraint. By the time they returned home, the boy was flushed and trembling, and his mother's fury was uncontainable. She accused her husband of cruelty, of gambling with their child's life. He accused her of coddling, of turning their son into something less than a man. That night, the house felt colder than it had in years, as though even the walls absorbed the bitterness. The outside world only added to the strain. Families of their standing were expected to host gatherings, to display their wealth and stability. When neighbors visited, the boy was paraded out, dressed in fine clothes, his pale cheeks pinched for color. He would smile faintly, but his silence was louder than his words. Guests left with uneasy impressions, murmuring later about how strange the child seemed, how fragile, how unnatural the tension in the family felt beneath their polished manners. Each whisper, though faint, found its way back to the father, who grew more rigid under the weight of what he believed was judgment. His reputation mattered more than anything, and the thought that people pitied them or saw weakness in their household ate away at him. There were also matters of money, though no one outside the home would have guessed it. The father's investments had begun to falter, shipments were delayed, and partners were less reliable than before. His fortune, though still vast by the standards of others, no longer carried the same security. He kept this truth buried, but it surfaced in his temper, in the way he demanded order in the house, in the way he snapped at his wife when she pressed him about expenses for doctors, medicines, or comforts for the boy. She, unaware of the full truth, took his anger as further proof of his coldness, never realizing that financial cracks were spreading beneath their feet. The boy, caught between them, began to withdraw. He spent more time in his room, staring at the small toys laid carefully on the floor, but rarely touching them. His world shrank to the space between his mother's arms and his father's stern gaze, neither of which gave him peace. He wanted to please them both, but their demands pulled him in opposite directions. His mother asked him to stay still, to rest, to be careful. His father asked him to be strong, to walk, to stand taller. He could not be both, and the pressure of it pressed down on him like a weight too heavy for his small frame. There were moments, though, when the darker currents in the household became more visible, and whispers about the family began to shift from admiration to unease. Servants in other homes carried tales: the mother's trembling prayers, the father's violent temper, the boy's eerie silence. Some began to suggest that there was more to the family's troubles than illness, that something unnatural lingered in that house. The photograph had not yet been taken, but already the story of the boy was being shaped by those outside his walls, their curiosity feeding on the tension within. The past, too, crept into their present. The father's own childhood had been marked by loss. 2 brothers gone before they reached manhood, a father whose sternness bordered on cruelty. He carried that legacy into his own home, convinced that only discipline could shield a family from ruin. His wife, however, came from a line of women known for their delicate health, many of whom had died young. She carried that fear like a curse, convinced her son had inherited not only her blood but her doom. These private histories, hidden from others, shaped their choices in ways neither of them could fully admit. As the boy's condition wavered between improvement and decline, the atmosphere inside the house thickened. Every cough became a battlefield, every decision a test of loyalty between mother and father. The servants, once silent shadows, now lived in fear of being caught in the middle of their disputes. Some began to speak of leaving, but few could afford to abandon such a wealthy household, no matter how heavy the air had become. The boy himself began to change. His once soft laughter disappeared, replaced by silence. He seemed older than his years, carrying an awareness that no child should bear. He watched his parents with wide eyes, sensing the storm that was building, unable to escape it. At times, he seemed almost resigned, as if he already understood that his life was slipping beyond his control. Each day in that house felt like a step closer to something inevitable. Love twisted into possession, pride into cruelty, fear into obsession. The family's world, polished and proper on the outside, was crumbling within. And somewhere beneath it all was the growing sense that the boy's fate had already been sealed long before the camera ever caught his final image. The house was unusually still that night, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Outside, the wind rattled against the window panes, carrying with it the smell of damp earth after a brief rain. Inside, every room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of gas lamps that cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. The boy lay in his bed, his small chest rising and falling unevenly, the rhythm of his breath breaking in sharp, shallow pulls. His mother sat at his side, her hand pressed to his forehead, whispering quiet prayers as if each word might tether him more tightly to life. The father entered, his footsteps firm against the wooden floor, his presence cutting through the fragile calm. He had grown tired of the endless cycle: sickness, fear, argument, and silence. To him, the house had become a tomb of weakness, and he could no longer bear it. He looked at his son not with the softness of a parent, but with the cold eyes of a man who believed he had already lost. He muttered about strength, about how the boy would never survive if treated like porcelain, but beneath his anger was something darker, a desperation fed by fear, by pride, by the slow collapse of everything he thought he controlled. The argument began the way so many had before. The mother refused to let the boy rise from bed. The father insisted he must. Their voices clashed, rising over the boy's shallow breathing, each word sharp enough to wound. She accused him of cruelty, of risking their child's life to prove a point. He accused her of madness, of smothering the boy into an early grave. The boy stirred at their raised voices, his eyelids fluttering as though even in half-consciousness, he was trying to make peace between them. But that night was different. The father's restraint, already worn thin, snapped. He pulled the blankets away, insisting the boy stand, that he show strength, that he prove he was not as fragile as she made him out to be. The mother clung to her son, begging, pleading, her voice breaking into sobs. The boy, trembling, tried to rise but collapsed back against the sheets, his body too weak to meet his father's demands. Something inside the father hardened at that moment. Shame, anger, despair all bleeding together until his judgment was clouded beyond reason. He grabbed the boy by the shoulders, shaking him, demanding that he fight, that he breathe deeper, that he show some sign of life stronger than weakness. The boy gasped a thin, choked sound, his small hands clutching at his father's wrists. The mother screamed, pulling, clawing, desperate to tear the boy free, but the father's grip was iron, his own fear disguised as fury. The struggle was chaotic, lamps trembling on the tables, shadows jerking across the walls, the air filled with the sound of sobs, gasps, and cries that rose higher than the storm outside. And then it happened. Whether it was a final shake too harsh, the boy's already frail body giving out, or a cruel twist of fate, his breath stopped. His head fell back, his small frame going limp in his father's hands. The silence that followed was louder than any scream, a silence that crushed the air out of the room. The father froze, staring at the boy as though he could not comprehend what had just happened. His hands trembled now, not from anger but from the shock of what they had done. The mother's scream tore through the house, shrill and raw, a sound that carried down the halls and into the hearts of everyone who heard it. She fell over the boy's body, clutching him, shaking him, begging him to wake. She pressed her ear to his chest, praying for the faintest sound of breath, but there was nothing. The father staggered back, his face pale, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. For a moment, he seemed as broken as the boy, his eyes wild with the realization that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. He muttered something, perhaps a denial, perhaps a plea to God, but his voice cracked, collapsing into silence. The servants, drawn by the noise, gathered at the edge of the room, their faces pale, their eyes wide. None dared to move forward, none dared to speak. They had seen enough to know the truth, but also enough to understand the danger of speaking it aloud. The house, once a place of wealth and pride, had become a stage for a tragedy too unbearable to name. In the immediate aftermath, chaos gave way to a desperate, frantic order. The mother, clinging to denial, shook the boy's body, begged him to return, kissed his face again and again as if her love alone could breathe life back into him. The father, his hands still trembling, tried to compose himself, barking orders to the servants to fetch a doctor, though his voice shook with every word. He could not admit, not even to himself, that it was already too late. When the doctor arrived, hours later, the truth was undeniable. The boy was gone. His small body lay still, his face unnaturally peaceful, his lips pale against the dim glow of the lamps. The doctor offered words of pity, but his eyes betrayed something else. Unease, suspicion, perhaps even judgment. The mother collapsed at the bedside, her cries hollow and unending. The father stood stiffly at the window, his back to the room, his fists clenched as though he could will himself not to shatter. What followed was not calm, but a feverish attempt to control the narrative. The father spoke of illness, of weakness, of God's will. The mother, too broken to argue, echoed his words in public, though her eyes carried a silent truth that she could never speak. The servants were warned, threatened into silence, their fear binding their tongues. The house became a place of whispers, its every corner filled with the heavy presence of a child who would never again run through its halls. And yet, the crime did not end with the boy's last breath. It lingered, festering in the silence between his parents, in the guilt that stained every corner of the house, in the photograph that would soon be taken. The image, meant to preserve him as he was, became something far more haunting, a reminder not only of what had been lost, but of how it had been taken. The night of the crime was not marked by premeditation or cold calculation. It was marked by desperation, by fear disguised as strength, by love twisted into obsession. It was the kind of tragedy that left no one innocent, not even those who had meant to protect. And in the quiet that followed, in the echo of his mother's scream and the trembling of his father's hands, the house itself seemed to mourn, as though the walls had absorbed the horror of what had been done. That single night, that single moment of rage and desperation, became the axis upon which their lives would turn. Everything that came after, the photograph, the whispers, the silence, was only the shadow of the crime that had already unfolded in that dimly lit room, where love and fear destroyed the very thing they had sworn to protect. The boy's death hung over the house like a heavy curtain that would never be lifted. At first, there was no room for reason, only raw grief. His mother refused to leave his side, her body draped across his small frame as though her weight alone could anchor him to the world. She whispered to him long after he had grown cold, her words trembling, scattered, half prayers, half pleas. She denied what her eyes already knew, clinging to the faint hope that if she refused to accept his death, he might somehow return. The father reacted differently. Where she collapsed into sorrow, he built walls of denial. He insisted the boy had been too frail, too weak, that no man could have saved him. His voice, when he spoke to others, carried the sharp edge of finality, as though he believed that by declaring it God's will, he could quiet the guilt clawing at him from within. But his eyes betrayed him. Servants saw it when he thought no one was looking. The way he pressed his hands against the window frame until his knuckles turned white. The way he stood for hours in the boy's empty room, unmoving, unblinking, trapped in his own private torment. The servants, bound by silence, carried their own weight of fear. They had seen enough that night to know the truth was not so simple. They whispered in the kitchens, behind closed doors, about the father's temper and the mother's desperate sobs. But fear kept them still. To speak openly would mean ruin. To accuse a man of such standing was to gamble one's own life away. And so, they swallowed their knowledge, rawing the crime like a secret sickness that twisted through every corner of the house. When the time came to present the boy to the world one last time, his parents made a choice that would forever define the memory of him. A photograph was arranged, a final image of their son preserved in death. In that time, post-mortem photography was not uncommon. Families, terrified of forgetting the faces of their children, often turned to the camera to capture a last moment of stillness. But this photograph was different. The boy was posed as if merely asleep, his body dressed carefully, his features arranged with an unnatural peace. To those who looked, it seemed at first gentle, even tender. But the longer one gazed, the more unsettling it became. There was something in the stillness, something in the lifeless curve of his lips that stirred unease. The photograph preserved not just his face, but the unspoken truth that death had entered the home too violently to be disguised. The mother clung to the photograph, pressing it against her chest, speaking to it as though it were him. In public, she told others that she found comfort in having him so close, but in private, her fixation grew heavier. She spent hours staring at the image, her lips moving in whispers that no one dared to interrupt. It became her ritual, her anchor, and her prison. The father, however, regarded the photograph with cold detachment. He allowed it to be taken not out of sentiment, but out of duty, as if preserving his son's likeness might erase the memory of how he had died. He spoke of legacy, of remembrance, but he never lingered near the image. It was as though he feared that looking too closely might strip away the thin veil of denial he had wrapped around himself. Beyond the household, the whispers began to spread. At first, the town responded with pity. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices of the tragedy, of the sorrow that had claimed such a respected family. But pity soon turned to unease. Some had heard the mother scream that night, a sound too piercing to be forgotten. Others noticed the servants' nervous silence, the stiffness in their responses when asked about what had happened. Slowly, rumors took shape. They did not accuse outright, but they questioned. Was the boy's death truly just an illness? Had something more sinister unfolded behind the locked doors of that fine house? The family's reputation, once untouchable, began to erode. In church pews, people avoided sitting too close. At gatherings, conversations paused when they entered, replaced with polite smiles that carried hidden judgment. Where once they had been admired, they were now pitted and feared. Wealth and status shielded them from public scandal, but they could not erase the shift in perception. The boy's photograph, when it circulated, only deepened the unease. People could not look at it without feeling something unnatural, something that stirred questions better left unspoken. The mother withdrew from society almost entirely. She stopped attending dinners, stopped calling on neighbors, and stopped opening her door except to the priest who came to pray with her. Even then, she spoke little, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clutching the photograph as if it were her last thread of life. Her grief was a kind of madness, though no one dared name it. The father, on the other hand, doubled down on his public face. He continued his business dealings, attended services, and spoke with the authority he always had. But he was no longer the same man. He carried himself with a stiffness, a shadow always lurking behind his words. At night, when the house grew silent, he paced the halls, haunted by the memory of his son's last breath. He tried to justify it to himself, that he had only wanted to make the boy strong, that his intentions had not been cruel. But those thoughts dissolved into silence each time he saw the empty bed. For the community, the boy's death became a story retold in fragments, each version carrying its own shade of darkness. Some said the boy had been too fragile from the start, destined to die young. Others whispered of the father's temper, the mother's obsession, and the way the house itself seemed to carry an air of tragedy long before the final night. The photograph, passed from hand to hand, became both proof and symbol, a relic of grief, but also a reminder of the unease that clung to the family. Time did not heal the wound. If anything, it deepened it. The parents, once bound together by their son, now lived as strangers. Their grief did not unite them. It divided them, each trapped in their own version of denial and blame. The mother's world shrank to the size of a single photograph. The father's world became a cage of silence and restless nights. The house, once filled with echoes of laughter and argument alike, grew hollow, its walls heavy with absence. And yet, the boy was never truly gone. His presence lingered, not in the way of ghost stories, but in the way grief has of shaping every shadow, every silence. The servants felt it most, walking the halls with a quiet dread, never daring to speak of what they had seen, but always carrying it in their eyes. The town felt it, too, each time the family passed, each time the photograph surfaced, each time a whisper rose about the boy who had been preserved but not saved. The aftermath of the crime was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling. It was guilt that took root in the father, grief that hollowed the mother, silence that poisoned the servants, and suspicion that lingered in the town. It was a story that could not be buried, no matter how tightly they tried to seal it. And in the end, it was not only the boy who was preserved. It was the crime itself, captured in whispers, in silence, and in the haunting stillness of a single photograph. The aftermath of the crime did not end with the final blow or the chilling silence that followed. Instead, it unraveled slowly, spreading outward like ripples on water. The courtroom became the stage where the story reached its legal end. But for those who had lived through it, justice was never so simple. Trials dragged on, filled with testimonies that reopened old wounds and evidence that laid bare secrets the families had fought to keep hidden. When the verdicts were finally delivered, the room was divided. Some breathed a sigh of relief, others wept in anger, feeling the outcome fell short of true justice. For the perpetrators, the weight of their choices became inescapable. Prison walls did not silence their minds, and each day brought them face to face with memories they could not undo. Some remained defiant, convinced they had been cornered into their actions, while others broke under guilt, admitting, if only to themselves, that the crime was theirs alone to bear. The families left behind faced their own transformations. Those who had once trusted, loved, or admired the central figures of the tragedy now carried scars that would never heal. For parents, siblings, and children, the crime became a shadow stitched into their identities. Some channeled grief into advocacy, fighting for reforms so that others might never share their pain. Others retreated into silence, unable to face the cruel reminder of what had been taken from them. Relationships strained. Marriages collapsed under the weight of sorrow. Friendships dissolved when loyalties were questioned. Even for those not directly tied to the crime, but once touched by its perpetrators, reputations changed overnight. Once powerful figures, once admired in their communities, became synonymous with betrayal. No matter what good they had done in the past, their legacies were forever stained. The question of justice lingered long after the gavels fell. Was it enough that sentences were served or fines were paid? For the law, perhaps, but for the victims' families, justice was more elusive. No prison sentence could replace a lost child. No restitution could mend a fractured family. The cold precision of the legal system could not capture the emotional wreckage left behind. Some felt the punishments were too light, others too severe, and in between, many recognized the sobering truth that true justice is never neat, and it rarely feels complete. Outside the courtroom, society absorbed the shockwaves. Headlines filled newspapers and evening broadcasts, turning private anguish into public spectacle. The crime became a cultural flashpoint, debated in cafes, workplaces, and family gatherings. Commentators asked how such darkness could have grown unnoticed, how warning signs had gone unheeded, and whether the tragedy reflected deeper flaws in the community. For the town or city where it happened, life would never be quite the same. Streets once marked by familiarity were now haunted by memory. Neighbors looked at each other differently, wondering what secrets might still be hiding behind closed doors. The broader societal impact stretched far beyond the immediate circle. The crime forced uncomfortable conversations about money, power, jealousy, or manipulation, whichever currents had driven the act forward. It revealed the fragility of reputation, how quickly the admired can become the condemned. For many, it was a sobering reminder that evil is not always an external force, but something that grows quietly within ordinary people. The fall of once respected individuals shattered illusions, reminding communities that no one is immune to the darker sides of human behavior. Laws were reconsidered, protections debated, and institutions questioned. But the larger lesson was simpler. Vigilance must replace blind trust on a more personal level. The crime laid bare truths about morality and human nature that are often too uncomfortable to confront. It showed how jealousy, ambition, or desperation could twist even the most stable relationships into cages of suspicion and violence. It demonstrated how obsession could blind individuals to reason, pushing them down paths they swore they would never walk. Most hauntingly, it revealed the duality of human nature, how those who once appeared kind, generous, or devoted could also harbor the capacity for cruelty, deception, or destruction. Power dynamics emerged as another theme woven throughout the tragedy. Influence and authority, whether financial, social, or emotional, created imbalances that tilted the situation toward disaster. Some individuals exploited trust, manipulating others into silence or complicity. Others felt trapped by dependence, unable to escape the gravitational pull of stronger personalities until it was too late. The crime became a mirror reflecting these imbalances, showing how unchecked power corrodes not only individuals, but entire systems built around them. Ethically, the story posed difficult questions. Much responsibility lies within the individual, and how much within the society that surrounds them? To what degree do external pressures, financial hardship, cultural expectations, or systemic failures mitigate or aggravate personal guilt? Perhaps the most sobering lesson was about silence. Many bystanders had noticed small signs, uneasy behaviors, or whispered rumors, yet few acted. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or denial, silence became an accomplice to tragedy. In the end, the crime reminded everyone that inaction has its own cost, and that ignoring warning signs can be as dangerous as the crime itself. As the story closed, the enduring shadow of the crime remained. Time moved forward, but scars lingered in families, in communities, and the collective memory of society. Even as new stories filled the news cycle, this one remained etched into history, revisited in documentaries, whispered about by neighbors, and retold by those who had lived through its horrors. The people directly involved continued their lives, but none were unchanged. Some sought redemption, others lived with bitterness, and many simply tried to survive under the weight of the past. The final lesson of the case is not found in the verdicts or the punishments, but in the fragility of trust and the ease with which human bonds can unravel. It is a reminder of the thin line between order and chaos, between love and hate, between admiration and destruction. Justice, morality, and truth are rarely simple, and human behavior is rarely predictable. In the end, the story serves as both a cautionary tale and a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of our shared humanity.